Some commentators have suggested that humanitarian interventionism resembles more a form of global policing than traditional war. Such claims do not merely refer to the domestic policing role that intervening militaries are frequently required to fulfill on peacekeeping or counterinsurgency missions. In other words, the fact that on the ground, troops often have to provide policing roles in the sense that they have to keep the peace, they have to be involved in pacifying civilian populations or maintaining law and order. No, there's a more fundamental point here that is being made with the policing metaphor. It is the notion that the very framing and rationale of such military actions, humanitarian interventions, is part of a global policing of the world order. And that contrasts with the symmetrical conflicts between political opponents that are characteristic of classical interstate war. So let us sharpen this distinction again between war and policing. War, in its Clausewitzian understanding, I had the opportunity to deploy it several times already, but let's do so again. War can be defined as an external projection of force by a polity or state. It is typically directed against a political adversary for the purpose of achieving a determinate policy goal. War is an extension of policy. Furthermore, it is typically, traditionally, temporally delineated. It has a beginning and an end, tending towards a definitive resolution. Again, think about how Clausewitz talks about the decisive battle, the battle that sees the concentration of force and an outcome that settles the war. That is war in its modern ideal, in its Clausewitzian sense. Now let's turn to policing. With policing, we think rather of the enforcement of law and the maintenance of order, if necessary by force, within a determined polity. In other words, it happens within a state and society rather than between them. And policing is generally associated with a range of other social services and institutions of governance. That's to say that policing can be violent, of course, but very often it isn't necessarily very violent. Most policing doesn't involve force. Perhaps it's backed by the threat of force, but it doesn't involve force. And it is often in a relay with, again, other branches, other arms of the state or civil society. It has as its object the entire population within the said society, but is particularly brought to bear, of course, against designated outlaws or criminals. And the chief target of the police, of course, are those individuals who are seen to be in breach of the law or who are perceived as a trouble to the social order. But of course, policing has also a function of holding the entire population in check and ensuring that it conforms to the laws and customs of its land. Policing, moreover, operates continuously and indefinitely. Policing does not seek a final resolution. There is no war on crime that ever ends in the cessation of crime or the end of policing. Rather, policing focuses on the attainment and the maintenance of an acceptable level of disorder or turbulence. The task of policing is continuous and indefinite. So now that we've drawn that distinction between war and policing in these broad terms, we can then return to humanitarian interventionism and think or restate it in the light of those distinctions. One could note, for instance, that humanitarian intervention bypasses state sovereignty in the name of universal human rights. In other words, it is as if humanitarian intervention took place within a global polity. It invokes a set of rights that would be the right of a global society, and it acts on that basis. Secondly, military force is exercised alongside the operations of an array of intergovernmental bodies and NGOs engaged in the development and the governance of the areas in which intervention is pursued. So humanitarian intervention is, because it is generally associated with the reconstructions of society, with various developmental efforts, it appears often as a modality of a much wider spectrum of influence and practice designed to reorganize and govern societies. And we've seen this, of course, with many humanitarian interventions, where in the aftermath of the military intervention, usually in response to an immediate crisis, we see a long period of reconstruction, development, tutelage, during which the area in which the intervention has taken place is shaped and molded with the idea of a liberal democracy in mind as its end goal. Often that has led to states with often a quite spectral form of sovereignty thereafter. In other words, for very long periods of time, they do not become fully autonomous sovereign states once again. They become governed and managed remotely or through the expertise of a set of global policymakers, NGO cadres, and so forth. We also see, in the context of humanitarian interventionism, a tendency towards the criminalization of the enemy. And we can quite easily discern the logic for this. Because if war is being waged in the name of humanity, if we are claiming to wage war for the promotion, defense of human rights, then it stands to reason that the enemy must be, in some sense, against all these things, and perhaps then properly inhuman. They must be an enemy of humanity. And hence why we live in a world where the adversaries that Western states combat are most commonly designated as either rogue states, states that stand beyond the order of civilized nations of the international community, or as individual terrorists. Again, marked with a particular moral opprobrium and a status that makes them more criminal than political adversaries. Opponents in this view, are not recognized as legitimate political actors, with which we might enter into war as a form of intercourse within a wider negotiation. So when states go to war with one another, again, think in the Clausewitzian mold, states wage them with political objectives, and they recognize in each other that they have political objectives, that they use force to that end, that force is a medium, a trade, a currency in which they engage in order to determine whose will be imposed on the other. There is a symmetry and a mutual recognition involved in this. This is not present in a framework where the enemy is entirely delegitimized, either as a rogue state who needs regime change, or therefore to be completely overhauled and transformed, or as a terrorist that is to be either destroyed, taken to court, or occupying some form of limbo, for instance, the status of unlawful combatants in Guantanamo Bay. Think of the fact that there are still men residing in Guantanamo Bay almost 20 years after the inception of the War on Terror, who in a way are permanently stuck there because they are not recognized to be legitimate enough to be prisoners of war, and yet not properly criminal enough to be brought into a open legal process. Hence, from this perspective, humanitarian interventionism can be thought of as a particular moment, the exercise of armed force within a continuum of modalities of global governance exercised today. It is, in a sense, a form of crisis response to turbulences within the liberal world order. And the idea of war being waged through the modality of policing is, I think, a way of grappling with what in many ways diverges quite significantly in both its rationality and some of its means with the conventional coordinates of what we call war. In passing, we could also reflect a moment on the flip side of this coin and the way in which police forces in a number of states appear increasingly militarized. I think perhaps particularly in the United States, where military surplus has been bought up by police forces and where the tactics deployed often bear a resemblance to those that have been used in counterinsurgency theaters in the last few decades. So there's a much more generalized blurring of war and policing that is taking place in our world today that I think is worth considering, but that we can't more fully explore here for the moment.